social incentives to be a left-winger, because if you're not, you'll be harassed. And if social incentives play a pretty large role in how people form political views, then this is a pretty large disadvantage. The left is being really mean, really rude, obnoxious, and extreme. People will see this, and then they'll hate the left, and they'll come over to our side. And that was an idea. And then history happened, and the right lost on almost all the cultural issues. And so I think we can pretty safely say that that was just completely and totally wrong. If you want a how-to guide, the left has already made one for you, because what we're talking about fundamentally is treating the left the way the left treats the right. So you see the left calling out people in various ways. You see them threatening to disassociate with people. You see them trying to get these people punished. Some of these things don't make perfect sense for the right to do because of real-world factors that differ, but the best how-to guide there is, as a starting point, is in fact just the behavior of the left. But like I said, a detailed how-to guide is not the point of this video. It's just about me expressing some thoughts.
So that was a video by Sean Last, and I'm not going to tear it apart because, as he says, it's just his attempt to talk about a few issues, not to solve all the problems in the world. But I think it's progress for someone like Sean Last, who I think is still an atheist, to admit that fanaticism or a kind of religiosity or religious belief is really necessary ultimately for the functioning of society. That you're going to get this kind of entropic deterioration of society if you don't have, on some level, cat ladies and soccer moms and priests and bureaucrats and people shaming. And he even uses stronger language than that, than just shame. But this is something that people who come out of libertarian thought, who basically want freedom, the freedom to be left alone, who also want to see people feel the brunt of their consequences. Libertarianism is also about fairness. It's about, if people make unwise decisions, they should have to live with it. If people do bad things, they should feel the consequences of those bad things. That is a kind of proto-libertarianism that, before you even get into economics or anything, just the desire for fairness, and then one starts to believe that, oh, well, if we just took the government out of it, then sort of natural law would impose itself, the consequences would be felt, and things would be much better. But you come out of that libertarian mindset with this idea that it is bad to impose your will on other people. It's bad to think in terms of good and evil. It's bad to think collectivistically. It's bad to think religiously. It's bad to think dogmatically. You come out of that believing all these things, and then at some point you run up into this problem that it doesn't matter how many facts you have on your side, how good your arguments are. If you have secularized yourself, in other words, you've spiritually disarmed yourself, you've removed social institutions, you've attacked any kind of appearance even of religiosity, any kind of appearance of collectivism, then you basically, it's a disarmament that the left does not follow through on with you, and you ultimately get, a more religious situation than you wanted. Through your anti-religiosity, you end up with a society that's supremely religious, which is the one we live in now. So there are a couple of disagreements I have. I'm glad that Sean has come, I feel, a long way on this issue from the days back when we were libertarians. That's the reason I left libertarianism, is over this exact same video, like the exact same themes he puts forth in the video, that we can have all our arguments, but sociologically we see from history, history is not determined by the best argument in the moment. And so while in the end we can say logic reigns supreme and rationality and reason works over the long term, when we're talking about sociological phenomenon in terms of boiling the frog, in terms of all these social, it's a question of scale. So, we can say that, oh, well, in the long term, civilization set up on reasonable logic and rationality is going to survive longer than just the completely random, shamanic, crazy society, the society that is living in a dream state. The concept of time and chronology is non-existent, right? We can see the utility that technology it can help us, but ultimately you can't maintain that with itself alone. You have to have some undergirding faith that's unquestionable, that if people start questioning it, there's consequences. And for a long time, we've eliminated those consequences. We had a system like that. It was called Christianity, and fundamentally the Enlightenment thinkers have undermined it, and they've questioned it, you could say, starting with the Protestants, but even further back, maybe William of Ockham. The investiture contest certainly was about a rupture in traditional European structures of authority. And this is where I want to kind of switch gears into a discussion of why things are like this. Why is it that the left can be fanatical? They are allowed to riot in the streets. The right is not. The left are allowed to commit violence. The right is not. The left is allowed to dox you. The right is not. The left is allowed to harass children, as we saw with the Covington kids. The right is not. The left is allowed to, we go on and on with the double standard, but why does the double standard exist? It doesn't exist because the left is just better at organizing or they're smarter or something like that. There's a double standard because the system is rigged from the top down. It's not, the rioters in the streets did not make the decision to create a double standard. It was the media and the people who control the media that created the double standard. And so we have to understand that when we understand and we accept the fact that, okay, the left is fanatical, the left is religious, obviously, facts and logic can't defeat that. If you have religious faith in good dogma that is in accord with rationality and reasonability, that's obviously better than to have a faith which is, evil, right? Faith in Satan is not necessarily better than secularism. Faith in the supreme good of hedonism and sadism and hurting people, that's obviously not better than necessarily, it would be a pretty extreme kind of J-reg take to say that it's better to be demonic than to be apathetic. Although the Bible does say, I would rather have you be hot or cold than lukewarm. So maybe there's an esoteric argument there for that, the supreme evil of apathy. That would be kind of a Nietzschean take. But in any case, why is it okay that the left can do these things, the right wing can't? It's not just because they're fanatical, and they are fanatical, and they are religious, and that's important. But we have to see that the fact that the left is allowed to be fanatical and the right is not allowed to be fanatical is not just an accident of happenstance. It's not just that right-wing people happen to be more secular, or right-wing people happen to be more conservative, or right-wing people tend to focus on facts and logic. And I've made this point before, and I'm glad to hear, Sean, we're in agreement that when the right criticizes the left, they say they're wrong, they're stupid, they're unintelligent, they don't have the facts, they're silly, they're emotional, they're superstitious, they're the new Puritans. That's the criticism the right levies against the left. The left will say all those things against the right in a certain context, but they'll also say the right wing is evil and the right wing is morally bad. And even when the right wing is intelligent, they'll say, yeah, they're very intelligent, they're very competent, they're very strong, they're handsome, they're bodybuilders, whatever, but they're evil and they have to be destroyed. Absolutely. Doesn't matter about their competence. The right wing's really obsessed with competence and not so much obsessed with moral purity. So you could say it's just about the sort of mindset, the psychology, but there's an institutional basis for this as well, which is that if right-wingers try to develop any kind of fanaticism, they go to jail. We've recently seen that a group that as far as I know, has committed 0 acts of violence or terror has now been labeled a terrorist organization. Members are going to jail, I guess, for participating in a beauty contest. I'm not quite sure. I would then make the argument, because I know where people want to jump off from that point, but I would disagree with Sean that race has to be the locus of fanaticism. It doesn't mean that therefore, we've created this Manichaean view that is quite natural. It's a reactive view that says, well, if the left is making race the focal point of its religion of racial resentment, right? It's got a religion of racial resentment. That's what the left has. That's the most important issue. It's not actually sexuality. It's not actually economics. It's not actually social policy. It's not anything. It's race is the social issue for the left. And in many ways, I think that's true. But does that necessitate that the only kind of fanaticism that could or should develop on the right is purely developed around race? I think that's a natural reaction, but I don't think it's necessarily logical or supported by argument or reason. And what's interesting about this discussion of fanaticism is we can all recognize that a social hierarchy has to have a fanatical element. That is, there are certain things that go unquestioned, there are certain dogmas, there are certain taboos, there are certain things you just can't do, that you just can't talk about. Every stable social system, every powerful social system has to have those things. You cannot have a social movement based around being a provocateur, being a jokester, being an iconoclast. That does not a social movement make. At some point you have to issue taboos. And so we can look back and we can say in many ways Judaism was iconoclastic. It looked at all the gods of the Middle East and said, these are all worthless, they're idols. But then it brought in its own taboos. So it destroyed the old taboos, but it brought in new taboos. Christians did the same thing. They said, Jews, you've got the Sabbath. Who cares about the Sabbath? We care about the spirit, not the letter of the law. And so they were iconoclasts, but then they had a new taboo in the figure of Jesus, that you cannot blaspheme against Jesus, and especially not the Holy Spirit. And so they had their new taboos. And then you go on forth, and you see how new ideologies develop. They always smash old taboos, but then they bring in new taboos. And so the idea that taboo is in itself bad, that any time, this is the idea of nihilism, right? That there should be no taboos whatsoever. That is a mental poison. That is a mental cancer. That is not a legitimate ideology. It's not a legitimate doctrine. It's the negation of all doctrine. And therefore, it's the emptying out of the soul. And so that the person becomes this empty shell, this fragile calcium husk that can just be smashed at any moment. That's completely, like a plaything for anyone who has any, spiritual essence at all. When you don't have taboos, the only taboo you really have is surrounding pain and death, right? So the person who has no taboos in life, they really only fear death. And so if you just suggest to them violence, they scurry away like a hermit crab. The only people who are willing to withstand the brunt of violence, to stand up to that and provide any resistance at all, are people who have taboos that are greater than their fear of death. And we basically, that's the definition of fanaticism. But to kind of circle back and round off this topic, what I'm trying to say is that although fanaticism in itself is emotional, it is not strictly, in the practice of fanaticism, it is not logical, it is not rational. We can construct fanatical systems theoretically and test them as, would this be good or bad? So we could develop a taboo that says, you cannot work on a Saturday. It's a taboo that certain people have. Or we could say you can't work on a Sunday. Or we could say you can't work 6 days of the week. You can only work on Saturday. The other 6 days you have to do absolutely nothing. You have to lie in bed for 6 days a week. And then on the 7th day you can finally work. Now, while fanaticism is present in all of these systems, the three systems I've described, we can clearly say that while there is a pre-rational or irrational element to all three of these religious systems, we can actually judge them rationally and say, that one of them is clearly inferior to the other two, that if you have a religious system that says you can't work 6 days of the week, not going to last very long. If you have a religious system that says you can't reproduce, you're going to have problems. If you have a religious system that says no one in your religion can ever even have self-defense, you've got a problem, right? So unless you're integrated somehow into a larger social structure that defends you, for instance, the Mennonites were defended by the Tsar of Russia. Today they're police. If the Mennonites get have criminals coming, they can call the police theoretically. So there are examples where a religious group could theoretically not work. If you're a part of the ruling elite of Qatar or something like that, then you might not have to work 6 days a week. So there are certainly exceptions. But we can clearly see that religious doctrines or taboos or fanatical doctrines, we can judge them rationally. And so while I agree that the general conclusion that Sean comes to, which is that you need some kind of religion, you need some kind of fanaticism. It might call itself a political religion, it might not express a belief in God, it might concern itself with earthly things, it still has to be fanatical. I would agree in the general sense, the idea that because the left has made it all about race, therefore the logical thing is to make the right wing to make it all about race. I think that, again, that's a natural reaction. Does it stand to actual reason? Are there, first of all, are there things other than race that the right wing can idolize? I think the answer is yes. I think, people can disagree on what those are. Actually, defining what those are is a different question. Creating this, or instantiating it, clearly there are Christians who do not, race is not the central doctrine of Christianity. If you disagree with Christianity for whatever reason, you can say that there are still values, a mythos. The central founding myth of Rome was not the white race, right? So traditional paganism did not concern itself with the distinction between whites and blacks, and yet it was a religious system. Clearly an inferior one to Christianity, or else it wouldn't have fallen to Christianity. But we can suggest, these other forms of religion. We could talk about other political religions. Communism, for example, you could say had a fanatical element, was not, solely based about the difference between whites, blacks, and Asians. I think ultimately, to really blow things up, to really zoom out here, when we understand that it's fundamentally larger institutions, it's not racial blocks. Okay, black people as a racial bloc did not create the media that tells us that left-wing people can be fanatical, that's moral, that's just, that's Martin Luther King. Right-wing people can't, that's terrorism. The media institutions who do that are not fundamentally run by a block of Africans or a block of Asians. Mostly what I see as the motivating factor behind the creation of this religion of racial resentment is actually not done by people who are part of one of these continental races. Now, the ambiguity of the term race allows people to say, well, we can use race in a spiritual sense or whatever. I think everyone understands what race is. Race is clearly about continental bloc, Africans, Asians, Europeans, and so on. Amerindians, Australian Aboriginals. When you start going deeper into that, you're starting to talk about ethnicities. And then you're starting to talk about something that is not strictly speaking a continental ancestral definition, but now you're speaking about identity. And whenever you get into identity, you're crossing over into religion because you're talking about a set of mimetic transference between different people. You're not strictly speaking about ancestry, right? Someone who is born of two black parents, they're black. There's not really much that can be changed about that. That's simply something inherited. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is much more malleable, and we're getting much closer to the concept of an ideology or religion. You can say there's crossover between the concept of race, which might be totally ancestral, and then there is the concept of religion, which you might say is totally mimetic, although in that case there's also heritability there, right? So there's a lot of gray area here where we can't say that there's any area of life that is untouched by heritability, but we could also even question the concept of race. Is this concept of the black race, is that legitimate? Are Nigerians the same as the Hottentot people of South Africa, who are the same as the Ethiopians, who are the same as the Sudanese, who are the same, and so on and so forth, as these so-called Africans of the Caribbean or African Americans? When you see a guy like Cory Booker, is Cory Booker the same as Trayvon Martin? Are they of the same race? In America, we say so. Is that is that really an accurate depiction of their percentage of ancestry on a continental basis, or is that a social construct? So we can even deconstruct race, but clearly these continental blocks have a less of a mimetic malleability than other concepts like ethnicity, where there are people of, you can say the Irish ethnicity, right? What does an Irish person look like? Well, the stereotype is they have red hair and freckles and so on, and pale skin and green eyes. And that's the stereotype. Do a majority of Irish people actually have those characteristics? No, most Irish people have, maybe blue eyes or brown hair. They're maybe stereotyped as, a really Irish person, they would have this curly red hair. Well, yeah, their stereotyped as that is because it's an exceptional characteristic. We see that, we go, oh my gosh, how is this possible? Oh, they must be Irish. But it's sort of the fallacy of taking an exceptional minority group within that ethnicity, which is these really curly, red-haired people, and then generalizing to the whole ethnicity when the majority of Irish people are, fair-haired or blonde-haired or brown-haired and don't necessarily have green eyes. When we see that characteristic, we're pretty sure, that person is probably Scottish or Irish, because those characteristics are kind of isolated to those groups. For the most part, you do see some Germans with red hair, some British, maybe some French or whatever, even as far as Russia or whatever. So the traits get around, they've spread around the globe. But, is there a biological type? We can do some kind of genetic research, and we can make little haplogroup maps and scatter plots, and you've probably seen where we take a bunch of individuals, we plot them on an X and Y axis, and that represents some kind of FST value maybe, or some kind of genetic marker that we've chosen to isolate in this case, and you create these little blocks, and you say, there's some overlap here, but there's discernible ethnic blocks, right? And you can say that on a theoretical level, is that actually how it organizes, right? So do Germans in America, people of a German ethnicity, do they organize politically? Now, if you're a German American, you see another German American, maybe you meet them and you say, it's all the same in the German family. It's just like the Hakka people, right? It's all the same in the Hakka family. Maybe you do that. I don't know what the Germans are up to these days. And maybe the Italians do that a little bit. You see an Italian, you say, hey, goobity gabbity. You gift each other some spaghetti and meatballs, or I don't know. We can theorize. Clearly, there are instances where ethnic groups in America really are much more cohesive. In the case of the Armenians, there is a specific church, the Armenian Church, and so there's an ethno-religious component. There's a lot of other groups, the Amish, you could say, are an ethnicity. The Mormons, you could say, are 90% of mostly English descent, and they kind of form an ethnicity, or semi-ethnicity, with kind of blurry lines there. None of these things are entirely as categorizable as they would be in the simplest case, right? The idea of, where it's just you have a mass of people who are like clones of each other, clearly physically discernible, and so on and so forth. But essentially what I'm saying is that really when it comes down to it, we see the influence of these continental groupings as constructs based on ancestry. We see their sociological effect. Obviously, the left has made a religion out of, if you're of European descent, that's bad. If you're of African descent, that means you're more morally pure and more worthy of protection, and you're not really judged on. It's not a matter of how much money you have or how many friends you have or your athletic ability. They're not caring about those things. They're just caring about this continental grouping. Why do they have that belief? Do they have that belief because it's effective? And do they have that belief because it benefits them? I would argue in the long run, it doesn't actually benefit Black Americans to buy into a religion of racial resentment. They're not going to build institutions and structures that actually improve their true quality of life. And here's where I guess we get into our definition of what do we actually want. How are we defining these taboos of a fanatical religion? We have to actually ask what is important. So is it important to have a free cell phone? Is it important to have a television? Is it important to have a Netflix account? Is it important to have Nike shoes? Is it important to have a gold watch? Is it important to have jewels and chains? Is it important to have plated gold teeth? Are these things important? Now, clearly, a welfare state enables people who might not otherwise have these things to acquire these things, in the same way that criminality can enable people to acquire these things. But the question is, do you think, from a more basic level, is the acquisition of these goods really the most important acquisition you can make, or would it be more important that people acquire institutional affiliation with a church, with a family structure, with a institution of monogamy, an institution of marriage that encourages family formation, right? So now we're thinking longer term. We're not thinking about the hedonistic system that the welfare state enables, where, oh, now I can have a free phone, and I can get my Jordans, and I can get my plates, and I can soup up my car, and I can get a nice stereo system. All those things are clearly something that the individuals who purchase them, and they do purchase them, clearly that's something that they desire, or else they wouldn't put money toward it. And it's something that is glorified in rap videos. I do have to question the extent to which, if you go to children and you say, hey children, vegetables suck, you should eat candy. In some ways you're appealing to the natural hedonistic instinct of those children. But is that something you necessarily have to do? If you instead went to those children and said, candy's really bad for you and you should eat vegetables, and you didn't just say it in a dry scientific way, but you showed them like videos of Arnold Schwarzenegger like eating broccoli and beating up like men wearing candy cane costumes. If you propagandize children, they can actually undergo a kind of mimetic transference that overrides maybe a natural hedonistic urge, where they associate candy with the pleasure of sugar, and they associate vegetables with something that's bitter and disgusting. If you use a little mimetic, and you could even say religious imagery, artistic imagery that sort of mimetically attacks them and suppresses some certain hedonistic urges and replaces those affiliations, you're actually pretty likely to change the way those children view food and create a basis for the diet for the rest of their life. If you say, okay, kids, you like sugar anyway, but we're going to go on top of that and we're going to create a branding around like Skittles, and we're going to create some kind of nostalgic mimetic campaign where people talk about how, oh, I always used to eat Skittles when I was a kid and those were the days. And you've got adults who are like, yeah, those were the days. Skittles made my childhood. I think I'm going to go buy some Skittles. If you use advertising in that way, and I would argue that fundamentally advertising is just a highly mechanized form of religious inculcation, that there's no strict line between the propaganda of the media and the corporations and the propaganda of the church, which of course the left said, Voltaire, Enlightenment atheists, they said, oh, well, that's what's terrible about the church is a glorified advertising agency. I would put it the other way. I would say that what we have now in society is a demonic form of the church, right? It's a satanic inversion of the church, which is to teach people, hey, you need to restrict your hedonism, you need to have self-discipline. If you do that, you'll be more godly. To be godly is to be good. You're going to experience heaven in the afterlife. Those who disobey are going to experience hellfire. That is a system of pleasure and pain that guides people toward making better long-term decisions. What we have now is a system that not only allows people to act hedonistically, but even encourages that so that they can exploit them for money. And it's also for the monopolization of power and the disempowering of the population at large. So we're kind of getting off track here. This is the question, is a primary focus on race the most important thing that the right wing could do today? I've talked about it at length before. I've disagreed with it. I've said there have been many multiracial societies that have worked. we can disagree about, well, do they work over a period of 1,000 years? Then people want to come out with this straw man of, oh, so you're saying diversity has no impact whatsoever on a society? Of course, if people look different, they talk different, they have different cultures, they have different identities, even different ethnicities, that's going to result in conflict and nepotism. The only way to eliminate the nepos is to make everyone a cousin. If you live in a society where everyone's a clone of one another, there's no such thing as nepotism, because no one can favor their family or tribe over another because they're all of the same family. So obviously a more homogeneous society is going to decrease the level of nepotism, decrease the level of, therefore, corruption. It's going to increase meritocracy. There are a lot of good effects. When we live in a situation where we're no longer in that cauldron of earth that resulted in these different continental blocks. The reason why Africans and Europeans look different, they have different skin colors and other traits as well, is because they were separated for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. You even talk about the Neanderthal admixture, all of a sudden we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years. So clearly there was a long separation over a long period of time that resulted in these diverging traits. We don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world where anyone can go pretty much anywhere for about $2,000 at the most, right? I don't care how remote in the world it is, you can pretty much get there for $2,000. And $2,000 is not a huge amount of money, even for people living in the third world. And you can do it for cheaper. I mean, if we're talking about moving from the country of Turkey to the country of Greece, which is technically, once you get to Greece, you've got a free passport to Sweden, essentially. Turkey is bordering a war zone, so we're talking about the difference between Sweden and Syria as a war zone, although with some of the grenade activity in Sweden and the rape rate, you'd sometimes think in certain neighborhoods that it's a war zone. So that's equalizing over time. And theoretically, the idea is, well, how would you stop that? Because importing the third world into the first world is not making the third world a better place. It's just kind of making the first world, in many ways, a more dangerous place. Is there a way to avoid that, reverse that? Is that something that's desirable? If we suppose that it is the way that you get there by making race the central focus. The reason I think race is a distraction is because of this minoritarian aspect. When we talk about the concept of fanaticism, we're already talking about a minority. Most people are never going to be fanatics. Most people will sort of take on the garb of fanaticism temporarily in a very deceptive and hypocritical way based on their social circumstance. So most people have no beliefs and no gumption and no guts, and just, this is the vast majority of people, really, they fear death, and maybe they're decent people. I'm not saying they're terrible, but they really don't stand for any kind of ideas like politics, religion. It's just not super important to them. They wouldn't be willing to die for their religious beliefs, for example. Majority of people, and that's pretty much throughout time. But when you put people in a highly pressurized situation, a lot of stress, all of a sudden you can activate the appearance of fanaticism in a mass of a population. For example, if you cause a mass starvation event where 1% of the country is starving in the streets, people are homeless, people are prostituting themselves out to just get bread, people are standing in bread lines, it's just terrible. You look at the statistics and the average height drops by several inches in that generation because of all the malnutrition. That creates preconditions where all of a sudden people are ready to start marching in the streets and listening to speakers in the city square and create mass crowds and have vicious street violence. You can create those conditions temporarily. It's not really something that you can sustain for all time, except through artificial means, that is by religious institutions, which create pageantry and artistry and ritual that recreate those concepts of stress in order to maintain a level of fanaticism among the population. But fanaticism, my point here is fanaticism is not spontaneous. Fanaticism is not something that comes from within the population. Fanaticism is something that's imposed by a minority on the majority. Our concept of mob rule is that the leaders are saying, let them eat cake, and then the mob just gets really angry all of a sudden and spontaneously combusts and cuts the king's head off. But the truth is that in every case where you have a mob, you always have ringleaders of that mob. And you always have people who are leading that mob. You always have somebody who is setting it off. In every case, people really don't spontaneously organize without leadership. Once a leader is established, then you start to get these mass populist waves of people. But these populist waves can't accomplish anything if they're not directed. They have to be directed, they first have to be instigated and agitated by rabble-rousers who are a minority, who have the intelligence and cunning to manipulate the population to craft a narrative and sell it to them. And then you also have to have somebody who's going to direct that mob as it's forming and as it's activating. Because if you don't have someone to direct the mob's just going to dissipate all its energy into unproductive activity. It's going to riot in the streets, it's going to burn down local businesses, and then everyone's going to go home because they feel that catharsis. Was anything actually accomplished? No. Rather, if you took all those millions of people and you said, let's march on Washington, D.C., well, that might be a little more effective than burn down your local, target. So at every level, the instigation of populism and the maintenance of populism and the direction of populism is not something that's controlled from the bottom up. It's always something that's controlled by a minority, not necessarily the establishment, not necessarily established powers. It can be a rebel minority or a new insurgent or resurgent minority, but it's going to be a minority of people. And so if we're talking about a minority of people, I suppose you could make a comparison between communism and racialism and say that the people who were the communist leaders in the communist leadership were not themselves of a proletarian mentality. That is, the vast majority of workers really didn't care that much about ideology. The vast majority of workers never read the Communist Manifesto. They didn't care about the intricacies of communism. They just felt screwed and they wanted to smash the system. And the communist minority was able to take advantage of that and mobilize those people and direct them and preach to them. I mean, we see scenes of Lenin. Lenin's a great example of someone who would go into the street and he would give sermons to people. And he would not just get them angry and agitated, but he would also give them clues and cues, and he would sell them a mythos of you shouldn't just be angry, you should be angry at these people. And in order to exact your revenge on those people, you need to support people like me, and I'm going to give you sort of the symbols, the red flag, the hammer and sickle. We're going to create all of that. We're going to give that to you as a new system of good and evil that you can identify with. I think that is what's important. Now, I guess the racialists believe that they can take white people who, by and large, don't really care about. They do feel screwed by the system in the same way that the proletarian felt screwed by the system. The worker said, I'm a worker and I feel screwed by the system. There are probably a lot of white people who are saying, I'm white and I'm screwed by the system. In the same way, there are a lot of black people who genuinely believe, no cap, they believe, I'm black and I'm being screwed by the system. That's their perception. That's what's been sold to them. My question is, has the black narrative of I'm being screwed by the system helped black people? I think we can all agree, no. Fundamentally, black people, they're not having more kids, right? This is, the geneticist or hereditarian view is that, what matters in this world is whoever has more kids, and all that matters is genes and reproducing genes. Well, have black people had more kids or less kids since they've started identifying with their race ideologically? All right? Well, clearly they've had less kids. So the ideological identification with race has not benefited black people on a genetic level. I question the extent to which it's benefited them at all. And so similarly, I actually question the extent to which being fanatical about race would help white people. I have to question if that's all you care about is just birth rate. I would actually have to question that it's as simple as that. Now, the only thing that's important is not just birth rate. There are, of course, some people who don't have to have kids who can also be very important parts of a social structure. But it's something to think about. It's also something to think about that we live in not just a more globalized world than ever before, we can also say we live in a more imperial world than ever before, which is to say that you can't just, the idea that I hear a lot, by a certain Paul. Paul will say things like, well, what we really need to do is stress this idea that everyone has their own homeland. That, I guess, would sound a little more reasonable to me if we were living thousands or tens of thousands of years ago where movement between areas was really difficult. Since World War II, we've seen the power of mechanized warfare and the inability of small states to defend their true sovereignty. What we have since World War II is a huge amount of fake sovereignty. That is, we have small states that really do not have genuine independence that in many ways are integrated into larger imperial structures. During the Cold War, you had states that were affiliated with the Soviet Union, you had states that were affiliated with the United States, and then you had states that were somewhere in the middle that were being vied over. There were very few states that actually had genuine independence that were not either under the influence of the Soviets or the Americans or coming under the influence or contested between them. So for instance, we could say Korea. Korea as a nation of ethnic Koreans was influenced in the north by the Soviets and the Chinese, and in the south by the Americans. Vietnam, same situation. So with that being the case, we couldn't say that Korea or Vietnam itself was truly independent. There were many cases where there was not an outbreak of civil war, and yet there was still this internal division of many Latin American countries or African countries, or even Yugoslavia. There was this inner tension. Even within China, there was an inner tension of should we ally with the Soviets, should we ally with the Americans? At first, they wanted to ally with the Soviets, but you had a Sino-Soviet split, and then with Nixon, they start allying with the Americans. Since then, China and America have had this kind of détente, this very uneasy alliance, which is very powerful economically, culturally, very contentious. So what we're seeing in a globalized world, imperial world, it's not actually genuine and truthful to talk about a world of independent peoples and independent nation states. We can give the appearance, and certainly liberalism lies to us and says things like the Czech Republic is an independent country, or Mexico is an independent country, or Afghanistan is an independent country. We can tell those lies, as the liberal order does, and say, oh yeah, what we want is just more of this appearance. We want to give a greater appearance that everyone has their own little homeland and no one steps on each other's toes, and we respect everyone's right to do whatever you want, which is, of course, what people like Alexander Dugin have promoted, this idea that, oh, the Africans will be African and we'll be Russian, and then you can have the Europeans and the Chinese. We'll all just respect each other's culture and not step on each other's toes. That, I think, is a fantasy, right? So if we make everything about race, you're running up into this problem where you either have to lie about the state of the world, in which basically things that happen in Africa affect America. Things that happen in America affect China. Things that happen in China affect Europe. Things that happen in Europe affect South America. We're an integrated world. We can't turn back the clock on that. We can't erect giant mountains and oceans between us. We don't have the power of geography on our side in that respect. We have the power of mechanization just completely obliterating. Effectively, borders don't exist in a very meaningful sense in the way that you could say, the border of the Sahara Desert created a climatological border between sub-Saharan Africans and what we would generally say the Middle East and Europe, Northern Africa. We don't have that anymore. And we have to deal with this world where even if you don't want to go to another country and, control people and influence people, we see that in South Africa, there are still white people who are doing business in South Africa. We see in Haiti, there are white people going into Haiti and messing with Haiti. The Clintons, you can say Democrats are the real racists when Hillary Clinton and she goes and she starts messing with Haiti. I don't know what she's up to over there, but clearly there's a lot of white people who feel the need to intrude. And you can say, well, we should live in a world where nobody intrudes on anybody and we just leave each other alone. Okay, well, you can say that should be the case. Is that a realistic plan? Is that genuine? Is that honest? I often find that people who focus on race say, well, the only way to be honest in this world, the only way to be genuine, is to focus on race, to say that's the only thing that matters, and then we can move forward from there because we'll have the truth on our side. Even though we don't have the media, the military, we don't have any money, at least we have the truth. Fortunately, the truth is not a power structure. The truth is not an institution. It can't really defend itself in that way. Truth is only useful insofar as it's actually implemented in the creation of institutions and power structures. And now, it is very important in that. And we can't just discard the truth and do whatever feels good in the moment, because you might create a momentary power structure like what happened in 2016. You might create a momentary power structure that just totally dissipates into stupidity and riots in the streets is essentially what happens. So clearly you need the truth. We shouldn't discard the truth, but the truth is not a strategy, right? The truth can help inform us what should be our strategy, but the truth itself is not a strategy. Just tell the truth. It's not a strategy. That's not a plan. So when you say, okay, well, we should talk about race because that's truthful, because we'll tell the truth about it, nobody else will tell the truth about it, and that's our strategy. Well, I have to ask, are you really being truthful when you say things like, we're going to have a world of homelands and nobody is going to intrude on one another? That's just not true. Maybe you're not. Maybe you can promise as an individual that you will not colonize poor countries, that you won't imperialize weak countries. Maybe you can say that. Maybe you can say, I promise not to economically exploit third world countries. Maybe you won't, but there are other white people who will. I mean, there are white people who will go to Haiti and they'll influence the economy. There are white people who go to Vietnam and live as expatriates and get a Vietnamese wife. And there are white people who will do that. And the idea that you're going to create a system that's going to stop that, you run up into the problem of what is like the personality type, like how do incentives work fundamentally? I mean, can you have a system of incentives that just springs out of the air? This is that constitutionalism that we can just write a global constitution that says nobody's going to mess with each other and we all promise to play nice. How's that going to be enforced? By a world court? Well, then you're going to have a global government, and that again lands you back in square one. We're not going to have legitimate sovereign nations if you have a global constitution. Those two things invalidate one another. It's impossible to at the same time say we are going to not have any globalism, right? We're simply going to all be nationalistic. We're going to respect each other's rights. Well, who's going to enforce the respect of those national rights? It's going to have to be some kind of global force. Oh, you have a global force? Well, that's the ultimate sovereign force, not the individual nation state, or at least it's impeding the sovereignty of the individual nation state. You can't have absolute sovereignty of individuals and at the same time have law and order between those individuals. You can't have absolute sovereignty of states and at the same time have law and order between those states. You're always going to have conflict between states unless you have a higher system of authority that governs over those states and therefore in some ways limits their sovereignty. You can't have that unlimited sovereignty. And so by that token, we have to live in a globalized world. And we're going to have to live in a multiracial world. We are not going to live in a monoracial world. Some people would like that. Some people would advocate for that. Some Africans would say, without white people, the world would be a better place. There may be some Asians who think that the world would be nice if it was all Asian. And there's certainly white people who think that as well. That's not the reality of the situation. Whatever you might like, whatever you might prefer, everyone is going to need to deal in a pragmatic way with the fact that we live on a multiracial planet. And so, advocating that race should be the most important thing, race should be the factor by which we judge people, race is our interests. Well, there are a lot of white people who I really disagree with, and I don't want to have anything to do with them. In fact, I want to get them as far away as possible. I want to oppose those white people because they have a different religion. They have a religion of racial resentment. They might be white. They're not my brothers. They're not my sisters. They're not my kin. They're not part of my group. If they want to kill me and then they want to, they want to lift themselves up and ally with violent groups and try to suppress me and harm me, I have nothing to do with him. It doesn't matter that I happen to be white and they happen to be white. It doesn't matter, right? So fundamentally, what's important then is not race. What's important is most fundamentally ideology and religion. The idea that whiteness serves as a good ideology or religion seems to me to be contradictory, given there are so many white people who cannot be part of that ideology or religion because they're virulently opposed to it. I think attacking, when your enemy comes at you, let's say there's like a dude on an elephant. This is something the Romans had to deal with back in the day. Hannibal came along. He had the elephants, and he was charging straight at the Romans. Now, the Romans would have shield walls, and they had spears, and they had all these strategies for if someone comes charging at you with infantry. You stand your ground, and you impale them with the spears, and then you lower the shield wall, and you start hacking at them. They had strategies, they had tactics to deal with that. But with Hannibal, he had a big elephant. And this elephant represents money, military, media, all this institutional power that's coming at you, and you don't even have a shield wall in this case. What did the Romans do? The Romans did not stand fast against the elephants. At first they did, because they didn't know anything else. They had to learn through trial and error. Once they learned that standing against an elephant isn't such a good idea, they decided to step aside. They said, I'm going to step aside. I'm going to move horizontally to this issue. You're going to attack me. I move horizontally. The metaphor is supposed to illustrate when the left creates a religion of racial resentment, takes a bunch of white people, makes them just fanatical religious Puritans who, want to destroy you because you're not a part of their little ideological cult, and they're destroying, the social conditions for most people, increasing divorce, perverse sexual norms. We know all the things that are causing real pain and suffering to people, destroying the long-term viability of a middle class, creating a monopolization of power where, the people on the top get richer even during a depression, even during a recession. This latest economic correction we've had, the billionaire class has gotten 15% richer. So we see what they're doing, we don't like it, rather than say, okay, they're charging at me with an elephant of racialism, and so I'm going to charge back at them and say, hey, liberal white people, we're both white, we shouldn't fight, we should unite. That doesn't appeal to their incentives, and you should watch the Sean Last video again. If you really haven't, you need to pause the video and go watch it, because he talks about the fact that these people who promote, these white people who promote the religion of racial resentment, they are acting in their own interest. The concept of the cuck, I've criticized this before, is not a legitimate concept, right? These white liberals, they're not cucking. When the white racialists will say, you're acting against your interests. They say this about Republicans. Why do Republicans act against their interests? Why do they cuck? Well, they're not. They're acting in their interest as a Republican functionary. They're acting in their interest as a liberal ideologue. They're acting in their interest as a leftist. They're acting in their interest. They receive benefits for those moralistic actions and attitudes that they take. So they are acting in their interest. They're not acting in your interest. And so this concept of whiteness where, Republicans, why are you attacking me? Democrats, why are you attacking? We're all white. We should be united together. You can scream that till you're blue in the face in the same way the libertarians can scream, we should have a non-aggression principle. And why are we fighting each other? The state is our real enemy. You can say that to people and you can believe that yourself. But I'm not sure that's actually the best strategy. I'm not sure actually when someone comes at you with the intention to kill you and they come riding on an elephant of racial resentment, and you say, hey, get off that elephant and join me. I don't think that's a really good argument. I don't think that's actually something powerful or convincing. I think when you look at liberal ideologues, there is even an ethnic component. There's even an ethnic component where you see people who are WASPs. You see people who, a great illustration is people from Vermont, people from Massachusetts. White people are supposed to vote Republican, but these white people vote Democrat. Even the white working class of the Northeast, because there's a certain ethnic component there. They've internalized a certain narrative that when you hate on the redneck Republican, that is a different ethnic group. The Southern whites are a different ethnic group, right? And when you talk about the Unitarian Universalists, their kind of ethno-religion, which has then grown into like this liberal fanaticism and everything we're seeing today. They have an ethno-religion. It's a multiracial ethno-religion, but it's still an ethno-religion. And they do not have a common interest. The idea that all white people, if people see you and they're like, he looks like he's of European descent, the idea that all these people have the same interests, and that therefore you can make this pitch and get everybody on board, and the reason they're not accepting your pitch is because they're brainwashed and they're acting against their interests, it's just not true. They are acting in their interests. Their interest is to monopolize power for themselves. And the way that they do that is by putting themselves in a position in academia where they can, lord over you. And then there's a process by which, Gilad Atzmon has talked about this in his Sociology of Judaism, where he talks about the way in which Judaism creates structures that are not necessarily to the benefit of even the majority of Jews, but create a sociological defense mechanism. You can say this is what happens with a liberal academia culture, or the liberal academia cult. It's a religious structure. It's a cathedral, as Moldbug said. They are creating a religion of racial resentment, and then you've got like blue collar worker, guys up in these very northeastern, very highly educated. That's the differential. These are very highly educated places. They're puritanical places. These are very similar to the early Puritan colonies of America. They've still maintained really that kind of mindset, even though they might not be strictly of 100% English descent anymore. They've kept that puritanical mindset where even among the working class, they'll vote Democrat. That's how powerful it is. You can say on that level, maybe the working class people of Vermont are voting against their own interests. But I would say that the religion, the ideology that they have is not promoted by accident. It's not promoted by a mere sort of like, oh, whoopsies, we accidentally started hating ourselves. No, there is an incentive structure that led to all of that. You have to address that incentive structure. And the people who create the incentive structure are not black. The people who create the incentive structure are not Asian. The people who create the incentive structure are people who believe themselves to either be ethnically different or different in an aristocratic sense. I think it's important to look at people like Kalergi because I think he articulates this very well. When you look at Europe historically, there was a desire of the general population. When the Crusades was declared, there was a desire of the general population to attack non-Christians living within Europe, to attack non-Christians who were their next-door neighbors. The Pope and the bishops and the kings and the aristocrats put a stop to that. The mobs that were forming during the Crusades, the Children's Crusade and all these various popular movements that were popping up, they were more than willing, and even some members of the lower aristocracy were willing to take action against non-Christians who lived in Europe. But the aristocracy and the bishops and the elite of Europe saw more common cause with these non-Christians in Europe than they saw with the average person or the lower nobility. They believed that they were of a common type. And I think Kalergi articulates this quite well, this worldview that you really have to understand, because if you want to actually address the problems that are created in these incentive structures, you have to understand the mindset. These people fundamentally, they do not, like Bill Gates doesn't identify as white, and there's no amount of propaganda that you can use to make Bill Gates identify with the white race as a proletarian bloc or something like that. You can't use propaganda to change Warren Buffett's mind. Even Marcus Persson, who's become fantastically rich kind of as an accident. He was a computer programmer, and then all of a sudden he has billions of dollars, and he's expressed these right-wing, politically incorrect views. He's got billions of dollars. Where is his activism, right? So fundamentally, I guess my problem with the concept of white racialism is that the elite that's supposed to be coming riding in on the pony is not coming. These people I think, are fundamentally incapable of ever conceiving themselves as part of a mass known as the white race. I don't think that's possible. I think we can go back thousands of years and we can see that these people have never considered themselves to have common cause with the masses. When you have had success at integrating elites into a structure that benefits the moral code of the masses of the population is under something like Christianity, where they have a hierarchical structure, where it's an ideology, where we're all Christians, and there's the Christian masses who have to be reformed and educated and pulled up, and then there's the Christian elite who rule, and then you have a priest class and you have a warrior class. That seems to be successful. What I'm trying to say is that I believe that European elites have looked at the continent of Europe as a multiracial continent for thousands of years. Now, you might think that's silly, and you might think that's ridiculous, but these people who either come into power because they're extremely intelligent, they're extremely, in the case of the warrior class, maybe they're just extremely, it's not just their intelligence, but it's also their physical prowess. In other cases, they're simply born into their position, and they are taught that they are of a higher caste, that they are of a supreme people that deserves to rule. These people for thousands of years in these positions have never bought into the idea that they are of the same race or the same racial stock. Maybe you can find examples where, Queen Elizabeth or something is going to give a speech to the public and say, we're all British, we're all of the English nation or something like that. And maybe that works to an extent on a national or an ethnic level. But to say that it works on a racial level is very ahistorical, in my opinion. I think what is historical is you have a religious structure like Christianity, where the people at the top, they have an ideology where they have a kind of paternalistic view that we really are the Christian elite, we are really different from the population, we're not just part of them, we're not just another, one of them, but we're in the position where we have to continually train them and lift them up. I think that's a much better situation than the one we have now. Is that necessarily going to look 100% like the Christianity of medieval Europe? Is that even possible to resurrect? To me, it gets to the point where when people start talking about reading the Bible, and I think it is good to read the Bible, but when they talk about that as sort of an exclusive, when they offer, anytime someone just says, let's turn back the clock, I think of the position of the pagans with the coming of Christianity up until the time of Marcus Aurelius, where they said, well, if we can only turn back the clock, or maybe we just reform paganism, or something like that, that position of simply going back to Christianity as it was seems like a non-starter to me. When I see people who obsess over it in a puritanical way, maybe it helps them, right? Fanaticism is useful. But as I said at the beginning, fanaticism is necessary, but ultimately it's only sustainable if it is undergirded or influenced by a logos, by truth, right? So you can have a fanatical belief that the Bible is going to save you, or that maybe that's too general of a statement, because the Bible can be interpreted in a number of ways. I mean, even people on the left will claim to believe in the Bible. So the Bible is too ambiguous. Really what we should say is something like, just to turn back and to revert to an earlier form of Christianity, I think that's impossible. If Christianity is to survive, it's got to change, it's got to adapt to changing circumstances. In the same way you could say that, the Christian Bible refers to the Jewish people in the Torah as a system that worked. It existed because at that place in time, God said, well, we're going to have the Jewish people, we're going to have the Torah, and that's going to be the system. But at some point, things changed such that that was no longer a sustainable system. Things could simply not continue in that vein, and something new had to come, right? So I feel that we're in a very similar position. When you look at the time between the birth of Christ and the time of Marcus Aurelius, it is a very religiously confusing time in Europe. Nobody knows what's going on. They have multiple councils. They don't even have the Bible. They have a bunch of apocryphal writings by a bunch of different people in different versions. They don't know which ones should we include as canonical. What even should the authority be? Or is the head bishop, is he the bishop of Rome? Is it the bishop of Antioch? Is it the bishop of Jerusalem? Is it the bishop of Constantinople? Like, how does the structure work? What's the relationship between the priest class and this pagan warrior class? What about these people who believe that Jesus is not part of the Trinity? What about the non-Trinitarians? How do we deal with heresy? It was a very confusing time. There were a lot of people offering their answers, but to an average person living between everybody shouting, Trinitarianism is the only way, and then you had people, at some point the majority was non-Trinitarian, and then you had people saying, oh, the Bishop of Rome is supreme, and then you had other people saying, no, that's not the case. And this confusion went on for a long time, and it took a very long time for things actually to get to a stable point where anybody, like the average person, knew what was going on. It was just a very confusing time. And that was a period of hundreds of years of just constant instability. No one knows what's going on. Are we going to return to paganism? Are we going to have Christianity? What form of Christianity is it going to be? Is it going to be a Manichaean thing? Is Christianity, is it something that's Western European, or is it more something that's Middle Eastern? Is it something that's based in Iran? Ancient Iran had a bunch of Christians. Is it something that's based in Judea? Is it something that's based in North Africa? So there was a lot of uncertainty at the time. And so you can say that in some ways the birth of Christ was a certain threshold, but you could also say in some ways, Thales passed a certain threshold that led to the development of monotheistic thought in the Mediterranean. So as much as we want to have clear answers and say, like, okay, well, obviously, looking back on it retrospectively, Trinitarian Christianity, with a Bishop of Rome as the head of the church, obviously that is the plan that is going to work for 2,000 years and create a system that can hold things together. That's going to be the best way to do it. That wasn't necessarily apparent to a majority of people during the birth of Christ. It wasn't necessarily apparent to Thales, 700 years before. When you're living in the midst of a spiritual and religious crisis, the answer of what to do and what should you do is not necessarily apparent. That's not going to stop people from being fanatical. And clearly the early Christians were fanatics. Now, did the early Christians believe all the same things that Christians do today? Absolutely not. Did they even believe the same thing medieval Christians believed? Absolutely not. Their doctrines, their dogmas, and their worldviews had some significant differences, and we actually see that in the Bible. We see how they tried an early form of communism. It didn't really work, so they changed. Paul called out these people he called the Judaizers, who wanted to go back to Judaism. Judaism with Jesus as the head of the synagogue. And he said, no, that's not right. We have to have Gentiles in this. Then you had other people who were going the opposite way. So you had a whole lot going on. All these people were fanatical. They were all pushing for their own thing. There was a bunch of Christian infighting going on. And it was a really difficult process. That's just objectively the way things are going to be. There's not going to be, whoever comes up with the perfect system, and I have an evolutionary view of these things, is that I don't think, like, the Christianity that we know as the world power that it became, by the time of Columbus, that Christianity wasn't even created in the 1st century AD. Like, that was something that evolved over time. And when we think about, okay, when you ask somebody, how do you know Christianity is true? They'll say, well, read the church fathers, and it's like, what do you mean? Like, are you talking about the church fathers who were not in the Bible, not the people who wrote the Bible, but you start talking about the church fathers who were writing hundreds of years after. It's like, okay, that's your justification for Christianity, but what about the early Christians? Because they didn't have access to the church fathers who were writing hundreds of years later. So in that case, it's kind of proof that the early stages of religion can be significantly different from the you kind of have a pupa, the larva, the pupa, the chrysalis, the butterfly, like you have an evolutionary stage. It doesn't mean necessarily that you can't really jump from one stage to the other. We can't just say, oh, well, we can somehow square this circle and we can get to the final version of what things should be in the future right here and now. I think context matters, and you kind of have to deal with what's in front of you and respond to what's in front of you. That, I guess, to me is a form of humility. Can you know that, and can you understand that, and can you have fanaticism at the same time? And perhaps all this intellectualizing about what fanaticism would look like, at some point, while it may be necessary, and while certainly the early Christians did participate in this kind of intellectualism when they would write about the fallacies of the pagans, and the pagans would return with the fallacies of the Christians. They're writing these epistles to one another. So obviously there was a lot of intellectualizing going on, but in some ways, is that going to be the only thing? There almost has to be a collaborationist view where you understand there are going to be people who are intellectualizing, and intellectuality is clearly an impediment to fanaticism. And it creates all kind of doubt and confusion because it creates a kind of skepticism. That's the nature of the intellectual wants to find some kind of flaw and find how the system can be made more robust. And you can't build a system and live in it at the same time. You can't build a system and at the same time be a fanatic of it. Maybe there's some kind of charismatic unfolding that can occur when you have figures like Moses. But on an intellectual level, there's a little bit different from intellectual work to charismatic work. There are some examples. Martin Luther might be an example of some crossover between the two. But there's going to be people who are intellectual, who are dealing with it on that intellectual level. That might be necessary to work out these things to make sure that they make sense and they're sustainable. And then there's still going to be people who are fanatics. We're seeing people who are fanatics on the left. I don't agree with their fanaticism, but it doesn't matter that I disagree. They're going to continue to be fanatical. They're going to continue to be who they are. And I don't have the power to stop that. So there are going to be people who we understand that their leftism in many ways is based out of Christian traditions, whether they want to admit it or not. And so in some ways, that is a Christian fanaticism. Are there going to be people who say, let's just turn back the clock? There are going to be people who say that, and I don't have the power to stop them. There are going to be people like me who say, well, those aren't the right answers. We have to have some other answer, but it's going to be very ambiguous, and I don't know what it's going to look like, and I'm pretty sure it's going to change. Whatever answer we come up with is probably not going to be the best way for the next 1,000 years, and that sort of thing. That's not really a solution either, really. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I want people to be open to exploring ideas outside of race. Because history is global, history is multiracial, religions historically have been multiracial. We're continuing to see that. I don't think you can get around that. I like that Sean, as an atheist, is becoming open to the concept. I don't think he said the term religion once, but everything he's saying seems to me to point toward religion. I think it's good that people are exploring religion. I think that's what needs to be done. I think that's what people have needed to do for a very, very, very long time. And the best day was yesterday. The second best day is today. The third best day is tomorrow. So, better late than never. When we say time is running out, I don't mean that in the absolute sense of if we don't solve this problem now, the world is going to end. I'm not providing you that kind of apocalyptic fanaticism that if I was an effective charismatic leader, I would say something like that. But I think in honesty, the world is not going to end, but your world may end. If you, as an individual, do not become a religious person, you are not going to have the discipline necessary to make the decisions necessary to survive into the future. You are going to die in one way or another. You're going to spiritually die. You're going to physically die. You're not going to have kids. Your marriage is going to fall apart. You're not going to get married anyway. If you do not have religion, you are not going to survive. So that's something I feel like in certainty. And as much as I am a wishy-washy pseudo-intellectual who, talks about these things as in a hobbyist way, in the same way that I might play chess in a hobbyist way, I can say that with pretty fine certainty that people who are not telling you that are either lying to you, or they're deceiving themselves and lying to you in that process of self-deception. So that's just something that's fundamentally true. So I'm glad that Sean is pointing in that direction, which I think does represent kind of a departure from his earlier ways of thinking. Maybe I just haven't been tracking him thoroughly enough. Maybe he would say he's always believed this. But it is a little bit hypocritical if he's still publicly identifying as an atheist to then really be pointing toward religion as a solution and not doing the hard, difficult, and in some ways impossible work of trying to transition into that. Once you realize that atheism is untenable, religion is necessary, and you're still holding on to atheism as like, well, I know it's not tenable as a social structure, but like it's metaphysically true, and I can't get around the problem of God. On some level, like, I guess your commitment to the truth is your own little personal fanaticism, but there's something, I don't know, there's something to me immoral about that. That if you recognize something that is necessary, and you're stuck in a situation where you're like, well, socially it's necessary, but and so far what science has to say, it's like at some point, if we're talking about the survival of individuals, survival of groups, at some level, have you done everything possible? That's my question to atheists. Have you done everything possible? I'm not a big user of drugs, but just a question. Have you taken the ayahuasca? Have you gone on the LSD? Have you fasted? Have you done everything possible when you say things like, well, I recognize the validity of religion, but it's not for me, or, well, I see the point of it, but I can't, I don't feel anything spiritual, or I'm an empiricist. Like, if you understand the social necessity of it and that there's no way around it, and you're stuck in a situation where you feel like you're telling a lie, have you done everything possible to investigate every possible avenue of exploration, of self-discovery, of experimentation, not just intellectual exercises, although you can do that, you can read about religion, but have you tried every kind of experiential method? Have you climbed up a mountain, and have you sat up on a mountain for 3 days? I mean, if it's that important, which I think we're starting to come to a consensus that it is, in a general sense, that important, have you done everything to push yourself mentally to that limit where you're open to the possibility of it, right? Because if what's holding you back is some kind of, science, commitment to science, it's like, that to me is in a sense crazier than the liberals who talk about how all white people need to die, and it's like, you're white yourself and you're spouting off this nonsense. But in a way, that's more logical, because when they say all white people, they're saying those other white people, the Southerners, the rednecks, the working class. Not me. I'm an academic. I'm educated. I'm not included. I'm of a different ethnic group. I'm an elite. I'm an aristocrat. I'm intelligent. I wear glasses. I drink soy lattes. So you've got people who are seemingly acting against their interests, but actually really they're quite selfish, right? They're not pathologically altruistic. They're selfish. When I hear people say things like religion is necessary, but I'm personally an atheist, I think that is like, there's a problem here. I think that's crazy. I think that's insane on some level. If you can say you've done everything possible, you tried every avenue, you put yourself through every test. What I'm telling people is to not be restricted to a bourgeois, safe, and familiar attitude of, well, I'm just going to do whatever the science tells me to do. It's not to say reject all science, but if science is an impediment to you having a genuine exploration of religion, then your attachment to science is a kind of a self-harm. Your attachment to science is a kind of fanaticism in itself. You might pretend it's not, but if you're literally, you're saying that the only way that we have any chance of survival is through religion, and then you're saying, but I'm personally an atheist. You are a suicidal fanatic at that point, and you mask it as, no, I'm very rational, I'm cold-minded, I'm stubborn. On some level, that to me is a kind of fanaticism. So you have the leftist fanatic who just is like genocidal and crazy, and we see the problems there. But then you've got these right-wingers who are like secular atheists and they don't believe anything. And I'm not saying I have all the answers for you, but I'm encouraging exploration. I'm encouraging people to go out there and to take risks and to deal with modes of thought and experience and behavior and ritual that maybe is uncomfortable for them because they have all these liberal enlightenment ideas that, that's a bunch of phony stuff, and that's just high-level advertising, and that's just, Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and all these people, these very smart guys, this priest class of atheism. It is a kind of suicidal religion. To have that level of commitment to something that you recognize is killing you. I mean, it's like, what's your reward? Oh, well, there is no reward. I'm such a badass, I don't even need a reward. Like, that's a further, at least the Christians will say, the Muslims and the Christians will say, if I am engaged in, like, suicidal practices, I'll go to heaven, right? Of course, if you commit suicide in Christianity, you're not, a lot of them will say you don't go to heaven. But suicidal practices meaning I'm a martyr of my religion. If I'm a martyr for my religion, if I hold fast to my beliefs, even if it kills me, at least I'll go to heaven, and that's more important than the physical life. You try to save your life, you lose your life. If you lose your life, you save your life, that thing. But these atheists who remain committed to their materialism and their science and their rejection of religion, and I understand sociologically it's very important, but I refuse to explore it. It's just all a bunch of high-level advertising. It's all ridiculous. It's all laughable. It's a big joke. No, there's nothing. When I die, there's absolutely nothing. But I refuse to engage in this. Going to church is silly. Having a religion, that's silly talk. That's a bunch of hallucinations. That's just a trick of the mind, trick of the brain. It's like, I don't know. The dedication to truth with a firm belief that there is no reward whatsoever. There is no reward whatsoever. I guess they'll make the Thunderfoot argument that, well, if we're atheists, then eventually, by being truthful, we'll create a better civilization because we'll eliminate religion, and religion lies to us, and that kind of thing. But I don't know. I think in the here and now, like, Spock, or I said Spock. His name used to be Spock Talk. Sean Last is right. We need people who are fanatics. Not everyone's going to be a fanatic, but you have to, on some level, understand the importance of that, and you have to do the hard work of trying to build something that can sustain that, something that is worth being a fanatic for. Because I'll tell you, low taxes and libertarianism is not worth being a fanatic for. And, conservatism is not something worth being a fanatic for. And, I don't even think at this point, like I've said, I've made the arguments about race, about why I don't think that's something people should be fanatical about. I guess if I had to try to tentatively put some words to it, it would be the fanaticism that people should have is self-control, discipline, and freedom from slavery, which doesn't mean low taxes and it doesn't mean conservatism. It means that you attain the power to be able to do what you want, and you attain actions. You act in such a way that you look back upon your actions and you judge them as good. right? You attain the power to live in such a way that you make choices that are good for your future self. You are kind to yourself. You are not engaging in self-destructive acts. And you have focus, and you have the ability to enjoy things which are difficult. I think, and maybe this is not the easiest thing to communicate as a fanatical ideology, but I guess to me these are the most important fundamental things, is the ability to say, work is really difficult, creativity is really difficult. There are things that are really difficult and require discipline, and you can't just engage in those things which are hedonistically pleasurable in the moment. You can't just, it's good, or it feels good to eat the wrong things. It feels good to be lazy in the moment. It feels good maybe to just do what's popular in the moment rather than take the risk. So the ability to overcome fears, which I think are a huge thing behind laziness, the reason why we don't have inertia is a lot to do with fear. The ability to overcome fear, the ability to master oneself, and to be able to act in such a way that you can be proud of yourself, to grow closer to your ideal, to ask yourself, what is the ideal man or woman? And how do I work toward that? What steps can I take? And actually going on that journey and going on the path to make yourself closer to that person you want to be, rather than just sort of living moment to moment and trying to distract yourself from the pain of not being that person. It is a kind of perfectionism. I think there might be something fanatical about that. And when you're realizing that your fear is holding you back, your fear is, if I try to do something, people are going to make fun of it. If I try to do something, it's going to fail. If I try to improve myself, I'm just going to realize that I couldn't do it after all, and then I'll be hopeless and depressed. All those fears that people have hold them back from mastering themselves, from mastering their fear. And there does need to be a kind of fanatical release of those fears, whether it's a fear of death or anything else. You do kind of have to be a fanatic to let go of fear in a lot of respects. It does take a lot of energy and power to overcome the fears that we've built up as these giant prisons. It's like Gandalf is on the prison of Saruman, this giant tower, this tower of fear and spikes and death that's been built up by Saruman. Saruman's fear has built it up. Saruman fears Sauron. He fears this conflict. He fears the war. He wants to be safe. He says, we have to spy on Sauron. We have to play both sides. We have to be very careful and clever about this. He's totally fearful, right? He's not concerned with, okay, we've got Sauron, we got this ring, we got to destroy this ring. We could fail, but it's still better than, this is what we have to do. At some level, I think that is what is necessary to be fanatical about. If I had to give an answer, it's not a perfect answer, but when people tell me I'm blackpilling them, when I try to explain, hating black people will not improve your life, and I get a response like, you're a black pillar. The average person doesn't understand that. We can't defeat the billionaire class, so, it's a gradual process of red pilling. No, that's just a belief you've internalized to make yourself feel good about these really wasteful actions and ideologies. It's like a progressive... it takes a while for people to wake up. First we just have to, make millions of white people hate black people, and then eventually, something real will happen. No, that is a cope. And your inability to look reality in the face and see that these things are wrong, and then to call anyone who points out the fact that these things are wrong, to call them a black pillar, that to me is a fear, right? And to the point of the atheist, what I think is good about atheism and what is fanatical about atheism, even if I disagree with it, but the character trait that makes people stubborn and makes people say, you know what, I'm going to believe in this even if it has terrible consequences, right? I'm going to believe there's no heaven and everything's terrible. I'm going to believe that because I have such a fanatical commitment to the truth. That is an attitude to be emulated. Not the idea that there is no spirituality or no God or anything, but the idea that I am faithful to the truth, and if that requires that I kind of overcome this depression of blackpilling, that I have the discipline to recognize the magnitude and the power of the system, to understand that there aren't easy solutions, to tell people it's not like, oh, if we just become like a slightly more right-wing version of Republicans, then like eventually things will just work itself out. That is an easy answer. That is taking an existing template and just saying if we just turn the knob up, we dial it up a few notches, throw in a few racial slurs, then we'll get somewhere with it. If we take everybody's in-group preference, if you just dial that up a little bit, everything will just work itself out. It's not that simple. And dealing with like the magnitude of the problems, it does make you feel like if you don't conceptualize your life as a process in which like you are supposed to confront issues, you're supposed to confront problems, life is not supposed to be easy. If you don't view your life as a struggle to unlock your true potential, and you view life as like, how can I be comfortable? How can I be white-pilled? How can I be satisfied? How can I... Like, there's two ways to eliminate fear. One is to say, everything's going to be okay. There's no problems. Trump will take care of it. He's monitoring the situation. Trust the plan. There's that mentality. And to some extent, people need that, right? Some people just aren't capable of dealing with the stress of a tough situation, and they need to just believe everything's going to be okay. And that, I look at Charles Carroll as somebody who's actually dealing with that reality of, like, there's some people who really can't, like, grasp. Like, he talks about the fact that if all you think about is evil and crimes, like, it kind of makes you into a criminal because you're just thinking about all these crimes all the time. And I think that's almost something that people have to... Like, you have to have that humility to be honest about where you're at. If you're in a position where if I tell you the truth, you're like, black-pilled again, black-pilled again. Do you have anything other than black pills? Like, if you're such a weak person, I'm sorry, but like, let's just be honest. If I'm telling you something that's true, and again, maybe this is an attitude that I developed out of being an atheist and arguing with Christians and feeling like they were just choosing the path that seemed like more optimistic, and I was the hard-nosed realist. I'm starting to see those mental parallels there. But if you're not willing to deal with harsh realities and to view that as a challenge, and in some ways to embrace it, like the heroism of the moment, that there's something that's so profoundly difficult and you have the opportunity to grapple with it, if you can't view that as a blessing, if you can't view that as something beautiful, that this encounter with a monstrosity, with a Lovecraftian monstrosity, if you can't see the beauty in that, if you just see the existential horror, if you just become depressed, if you just become black-pilled, like, you probably need to be integrated into a religious structure that shelters you from those stress. Because we have to understand, we have to be humble about the human condition, that I think all of us can endure a little bit of stress, and some of us can endure a lot of stress. Most people cannot, endure a lot of stress. And those people, to be effective members of a community, they need to be sheltered and shielded from stress. Like, watching the news cycle and being like, the economy's bad, cities are burning, just on and on and on. I don't have a GF, and just like the self-pity stressor, and just constantly like, if you're not willing to, if you're not able, and maybe there's a component of will, you can will yourself out of this mental state and like snap yourself out of it, slap yourself in the face and toughen up. I don't know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But at some point, I think there are people where it's like, they don't need to be watching the news. They don't need to be worried about the future of civilization. There's some people, and they can be very smart people, and they can be very capable in some cases. It's not even saying they're bad people, but it's like if you can't handle those realities, then like maybe you need to stop paying attention to politics in the news, and maybe you need to get involved with a religious practice in a community. And there are going to be people like that. I don't think that everyone needs to be like a hard-nosed realist who enjoys the thrill of fighting the Colossus. I don't think everyone needs to be like that. I think a lot of people need to recognize that like constantly engaging with politics, there's a limit to how much they can engage before they just like become depressed. And there's no point anymore because they don't, I mean, none of us control politics, right? So what's the point of becoming so fixated on it? It takes over your life and you can't even do anything about it. So like there's an element where I think people have to have the self-knowledge to say like, this is my tolerance for politics, this is my tolerance for the news, and I need to place myself and support communal structures accordingly. If you're someone with you're very sensitive to the stressors of the world, don't hate yourself for that. Like, I mean, I guess I use the word weak, and I think certain people that's applicable to, because I think certain people really aren't using their potential to endure stress. But some people, it's like, I don't even want to use that term weak as a value judgment of saying like they're bad people or flawed because of that. I think it's important that we even have sensitive people in the world. There are going to be people who are just, you know, beings of pure light and happiness and joy and mirth, and they just want to spread positivity. And like the hard-nosed pessimist Schopenhauer guy wants to be like, oh, those people are weak. And I think that's my bias, and that's where I tend to attack people on. But then I think there has to be kind of like a mutual, there has to be some kind of mediating communal language where people who are the Baldur archetype, or even in some cases the Christ archetype, although Christ does get pretty radical in a lot of places. You know, but the I mean, I think a lot of times the Baldur archetype was integrated into the imagery of Christ, the androgynous Christ that's portrayed by the Catholic Church and so on, the blonde hair, blue-eyed, wispy beard Christ who looks like a woman with a beard, you know what the depiction I'm talking about. But the Baldur archetype is a Norse archetype, and of course the Norse were very violent people, but they had this archetype of Baldur, who's a completely non-violent pacifist god. He represents pure positivity. And there are people who are going to be that Baldur archetype. And those people have a purpose and a function. And as much as it's my like gut reaction to be, you know, attack those people, that's something that I have to question. Because I think those people do serve a function. I think everyone at some point needs refuge and release and catharsis from the stress that we experience. And you can go to those people and they can be that being of positivity. It's like, you know, your mom doesn't need to be the most political person in the world. You don't need to red pill your mom. But like when things are getting you down, like you go to your mom and she's got like some milk and cookies and some chicken noodle soup, you know, and she's got the mom hugs and like, you know, that, and I'm not saying everybody who's positive is like a womanly or motherly figure. Maybe there's a maternal aspect to it in a universally transgendered sense. But there need to be people like that. And then there also need to be people who actually enjoy, like the more difficult and stressful a situation is, the more they enjoy it. The more they get a kick out of it. They're like, yeah, just bring it on. Bring it on. Bring on the black pills. You know, it's like I'm chomping on black pills. I'm fueled. Like you can't stop me. To me, that's the representative of the heroic archetype who goes into the dragon's den. And he doesn't go into the dragon's den like fearfully and like depressed and like, oh, this dragon's gonna kill me. He breathes fire. He's big. He's got scales. Like, this isn't gonna go well. I should just give up. I should turn around. He's like, I'm gonna go in there and fight that dragon, even if it kills me. I'm just gonna go toe to toe with that dragon, and I'm gonna make him pay. There is an element of as much as the former archetype is a maternal archetype. There's an element of sadism to this archetype, and maybe even a masochism of the scene in Fight Club where the main character, the protagonist, he's like beating himself up in front of his boss, and he enjoys it. He's like, yeah, I'm crazy. I'm willing to beat myself up in front of you. I'm willing to do anything, and physical pain means nothing to me. Like there's something hero. I mean, it's obviously a twisted scene in a lot of ways, but there's something heroic about the person who's willing to be a martyr, who doesn't care if they live or die, and they're just doing what they think is right. In the case of Fight Club, I don't know if you could fight, but he is trying to overcome the slavery of the corporate world. In many ways, he's fighting the corporate behemoth. You could say that is his hero's quest in Fight Club. But there's an archetype that's needed there, that's necessary. And if those archetypes can be mediated through some kind of communal language and structure, where we can have these refuge points where people can go and they can get that positivity, and then other people can go and they can sort of be on the front lines of dealing with the problems and understanding that the answers aren't easy, that just because the left pushes you, that just because they come at you with an elephant doesn't mean you just stand there with your spear and be like, oh, if you charge at me, I'm going to charge at you. Racial resentment? Two can play that game. It's like, who's racial resentment helping? Is it helping black people? Is it helping Asians? Why was it created? Who created it? Did black people invent critical theory? Did Asian people invent critical theory? Or was it like white aristocrats and elites and academics and white ethnics who created that? We've talked for quite a while. This is the longest video I've done in a while. Good video by Sean Last. Lots of things to talk about. Lots of themes we're reiterating, going over, rehearsing. I think we're gonna kick it to the curb. See you next time. Bye bye.